I'm Franklin. What do you know about mafia accountants? In July 1932, Chicago didn't feel like a city. It felt like an oven that someone had forgotten to turn off. The Great Depression had stripped the gold off the Windy City's teeth, leaving nothing but rust and desperation. While the breadline stretched for blocks, the heat climbed to a record-breaking 102 degrees, and the air in the South Side was so thick with humidity and slaughterhouse stench, you could almost chew it. Arthur Penhaligon sat in his third-floor office above the Velvet Note, a jazz club that usually didn't start screaming until sundown. But today, the heat had made everyone restless. Arthur was a small man, built like a question mark, with spectacles that were constantly sliding down a nose slick with sweat. For 12 years, he had been the chief accountant for Silas, the butcher, Moretti, the Shadow King of the North Syndicate. Silas didn't just break bones, he broke systems, and Arthur was the one who kept the gears greased. On his mahogany desk lay the Black Ledger, a leather-bound book that contained the true DNA of Chicago. It held the names of judges who were on the payroll, police captains who turned a blind eye to the midnight shipments of Canadian rye, and the exact cost of a senator's soul. Arthur's hand trembled as he dipped his pen into the inkwell one last time. He wasn't adding a new entry. He was writing a suicide note, or a map to freedom. 2 hours ago, Arthur had overheard a conversation through the ventilation shaft. Silas was trimming the fat. In the underworld, that meant the people who knew where the bodies were buried were about to join them. And Arthur knew where every single one was, not just the bodies, but the bank accounts that paid for the shovels. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of a typewriter from the outer office stopped abruptly. The heavy, rhythmic thud of leather-soled boots began to echo in the hallway. These weren't the light steps of the typist. These were the boots of men who carried weight. Arthur felt a drop of sweat run down his spine, cold against his skin despite the 100-degree room. He looked at the clock. 3:15 p.m. The Mercury Limited was scheduled to pull out of Union Station at 5 p.m., 90 minutes to cross a city that was currently a tinderbox ready to ignite. He closed the ledger. He didn't put it in the safe. He slid it into a false-bottomed physician's bag, covering it with a stethoscope and a few jars of quinine. In a city of dying men, no one stopped a doctor. The office door handle began to turn, slowly, deliberately. Arthur didn't panic. He moved with the precision of a man who had spent a decade balancing books to the penny. He stepped onto the fire escape, the iron grating so hot it sizzled against his soles. He didn't look back as he descended into the alleyway, where the heat hit him like a physical blow. The alley was a canyon of brick and garbage. At the far end, parked under the flickering shadow of the L train tracks, was a black Cadillac. Two of Moretti's cleaners, men with faces like crushed gravel and eyes that saw only targets, were leaning against the fenders, their hands tucked into the pockets of their sweat-stained linen coats. They weren't looking for a doctor. They were looking for a bookkeeper who hadn't come out for lunch. Arthur gripped the handle of his bag. He had to reach the station. But the Syndicate didn't just own the streets, they owned the heat. And Silas Moretti didn't like it when his numbers didn't add up. "Hey, Doc," one of the men barked, pushing off the car. "You're in a hurry for a man carrying medicine for the dead." Arthur's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He adjusted his hat, pulling the brim low to hide the terror in his eyes. "The heat doesn't wait for the living, gentlemen," Arthur replied, his voice surprisingly steady. "And neither does a heart attack." Arthur Penhaligon stepped out of the alley's shadow and into the blinding glare of Wabash Avenue. The sun was a white-hot coin pressed against the pale forehead of the sky. The city was screaming, not with the roar of a hurricane, but with the low, constant vibration of millions of people suffering in unison. The heat had a sound, the hum of thousands of electric fans that did nothing but stir the smell of horse manure, hot grease, and coal smoke into a thick, invisible soup. Every man on the street had a dark, wet V-shape of sweat on the back of his shirt. Every woman's face was shiny and pale under her wide-brimmed hat. Arthur walked with a deliberate, rhythmic stride. "Don't run," he told himself. "A doctor doesn't run unless someone is bleeding out." He reached the corner of State Street. The sidewalk was packed with the unemployed armies. Men in tattered suits sitting on the curbs, staring into space with eyes that looked like scorched glass. Arthur felt the weight of the black ledger in his bag. It felt heavier than 40 pounds of lead. To him, it wasn't just paper and ink. It was the combined sins of a decade, and it was radiating a heat of its own. "Get your ice, 5 cents a block. Save your soul from the fire," a street vendor yelled, his voice cracking from the dust. Arthur caught a glimpse of a black Packard cruising slowly against the flow of traffic. The windows were rolled down, and the men inside were scanning the sidewalk. Silas's hounds. They were looking for a man in a gray suit and round spectacles. Arthur ducked into the doorway of a pharmacy, the bell above the door ringing with a sharp, mocking sound. Inside, the air was marginally cooler, smelling of menthol and floor wax. He stood by a spinning rack of postcards, his heart performing a frantic tap dance against his lungs. Through the glass, he watched the Packard pass. It didn't stop. "Can I help you, mister?" a young clerk asked, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy rag. Just looking for a tonic for the nerves," Arthur whispered. "The heat is a beast today." "The heat ain't the half of it. Heard there was a shooting over on 22nd. One of Moretti's boys. They say the boss is looking for someone. Some rat who took something that didn't belong to him." Arthur's hand tightened on the handle of his physician's bag. He didn't answer. He turned and walked back out into the furnace. He decided to take the streetcar. It was riskier, but the walk to Union Station would take 40 minutes, and in this heat, his strength was already flagging. The streetcar rattled toward the stop, its metal frame shimmering in the heat haze. It was packed. People were pressed together, their skins slick and sticky, the air inside the car smelling of sour wool and cheap tobacco. Arthur squeezed onto the rear platform. He held the bag between his feet. 2 stops later, a man boarded. He was tall, wearing a pinstripe suit that looked too expensive for a streetcar. He had a scar that ran from the corner of his mouth to his ear, a Glasgow smile that had been poorly stitched. This was Vinny the Needle Russo, Moretti's favorite interrogator. Vinny didn't see Arthur at first. He stood by the conductor, his eyes roaming over the passengers with the cold, practiced indifference of a butcher looking for a specific cut of meat. The streetcar lurched forward. Arthur lowered his head, praying that the shadow of his fedora would be enough. He watched Vinny move. The man was sniffing the air, literally. He had a nose for fear, and right now, Arthur was radiating enough of it to power a city block. "Hot enough for you, Vinny?" the conductor joked, clearly knowing who the passenger was. "I've seen hotter," Vinny rasped. His eyes landed on the physician's bag at Arthur's feet. Since when do doctors take the trolley on a day like this? The car went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels and the distant, lonely wail of a jazz trumpet from a nearby window. Arthur felt the sweat pooling in his shoes. He looked up, his spectacles reflecting the harsh afternoon sun. "Since the hospital's ambulances all broke down from the heat, sir," Arthur said, pitching his voice an octave lower. There is an outbreak of heat stroke in the tenements. I have 6 more calls before I can even think of a glass of water. Vinny stepped closer. He was so close, Arthur could smell the expensive pomade in his hair and the faint scent of garlic on his breath. Vinny looked at the bag, then at Arthur's hands. "You got steady hands for an old doc," Vinny said, reaching into his pocket. Arthur reached for the .32 caliber pistol he had tucked into the bag's side pocket, his fingers brushing against the cool leather of the ledger. This was it. On a crowded streetcar in the middle of a Chicago afternoon, the boiling point had been reached. Vinny the needle. Russo's hand slid into his jacket pocket. Arthur Penhaligon braced himself, his own fingers closing around the cold steel of the .32 pistol hidden in the side compartment of his physician's bag. The streetcar rattled, a moving cage in the suffocating heat. Every eye in the car was fixed on them, but no one dared to move or speak. This was Chicago. Everyone knew the rules. Vinny pulled out a silver flask, not a weapon. He took a long swig, his eyes never leaving Arthur's face. "A good tonic for the nerves, Doc," Vinny rasped, offering the flask. "Homemade rye. Better than anything from a pharmacy. You look like you could use a shot." Arthur hesitated. To refuse would be an insult. To accept, a potential trap. He took the flask. The metal was warm, almost hot to the touch. He lifted it to his lips, pretending to take a sip, but really just breathing in the harsh, alcoholic vapor. "My thanks, sir," Arthur said, handing it back. "But a doctor must keep his wits. The heat plays tricks on the mind." Vinny's eyes narrowed. "It surely does." "So, where's this hospital, Doc? That's so busy the ambulances are all dead?" Arthur pointed vaguely towards the west. "St. Jude's, near the stockyards. The smell is unfortunate for the patients, but they are poor and sick." Vinny chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "St. Jude's, eh? Never heard of it. But I'll take your word for it, Doc. You look like a man who knows his way around the sick." The streetcar finally reached Arthur's stop. He pushed his way through the sweaty bodies, feeling Vinny's eyes on his back until he stepped onto the scorching pavement. He didn't look back. He kept walking, trying to lose himself in the stream of desperate faces flowing down Randolph Street. He knew St. Jude's was a defunct charity hospital, long since bought out by Moretti's Syndicate for use as a warehouse. Vinny would know that. The man was testing him. Arthur had bought himself minutes, not freedom. He had to get off the main arteries. He turned into an alley, the smell of stale beer and rotting fruit hitting him like a punch. This was the territory of the Hoovervilles, shanty towns built by the homeless in the shadow of the wealthy skyscrapers. Cardboard shacks and rusty lean-tos stretched for blocks. Children, their faces smudged with dirt, played in puddles of stagnant water. Arthur moved quickly now, his physician's bag bumping against his hip. This was a maze, a honeycomb of desperation, but also a shield. The Syndicate's men wouldn't patrol these forgotten streets. They were too busy guarding the main exits, the train station, the ports. He heard the distant, mournful wail of a police siren. It could be for anything, a domestic dispute, a robbery. Or it could be for him. He emerged from the shantytown near the Chicago River. The water was sluggish, brown, and reflecting the blinding glare of the sun. Freight barges, heavy with cargo, moved slowly under the drawbridges. Union Station was now visible in the distance, a massive stone edifice that looked like a fortress. But between Arthur and the station lay a stretch of open street, exposed and dangerous. And on the far side, across the street, a familiar black Packard was parked. 2 men were leaning against it, their fedoras pulled low. They hadn't seen him yet. They were watching the main entrance to the station. Arthur knew he couldn't cross. He needed a distraction. He looked around. A stack of empty wooden crates stood beside a loading dock. Further down, a derelict fishing boat, half sunk in the oily water, was leaking a slow trickle of gasoline. An idea, reckless and desperate, formed in his mind. He pulled a box of matches from his pocket. He crept along the riverbank, his heart pounding. He reached the crates, doused them with the gasoline from the boat, and struck a match. The dry wood caught instantly, sending a plume of black smoke spiraling into the oppressive sky. "Fire! Fire on the docks!" Arthur screamed, his voice raw. The two men by the Packard looked up. They saw the smoke, then the flames. They cursed and began to run towards the dock, yelling for help. This was his chance. Arthur bolted across the street, dodging a yellow taxi and a horse-drawn delivery cart. He reached the other side, his lungs burning, his legs screaming for mercy. He didn't stop. He pushed through the surging crowd that was now running towards the fire, using the chaos as his final cloak. Union Station. Its massive, arching entrance loomed before him, promising salvation. But salvation always came with a price. As he reached the marble steps, he saw him. Silas, the butcher, Moretti himself. He was standing by the massive brass doors, flanked by 4 of his toughest enforcers. Silas wasn't wearing his usual crisp suit. He was in a lightweight linen outfit, his tie loosened, his face slick with sweat, but his eyes were as cold and sharp as a meat hook. He was waiting. He knew Arthur would come here. Arthur clutched his physician's bag, feeling the heavy, cold weight of the ledger. His train was leaving in 15 minutes. The Great Hall of Union Station was a cathedral of limestone and desperation. Sunlight streamed through the massive thermal windows in solid, dusty beams, illuminating thousands of travelers who looked like ants scurrying across a giant's floor. The air inside was a toxic mix of steam from the locomotives, expensive perfume, and the sour, pervasive smell of crowded humanity. Silas, the butcher Moretti, stood at the center of the hall, near the information kiosk. He didn't look like a gangster. He looked like a weary businessman waiting for a late relative. But his presence created a vacuum around him. People sensed the violence vibrating beneath his linen suit and instinctively steered clear. Arthur Penhaligon stood behind a massive marble pillar, his chest heaving. His physician's bag felt like it was filled with lead. He checked his pocket watch. 4:52 p.m., 8 minutes until the Mercury Limited pulled out for New York. Moretti wasn't just watching the gates. He was watching the rhythm of the station. He knew Arthur. He knew Arthur's nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles and his slightly uneven gait. Arthur looked at the ceiling. High above, the steel trusses formed a complex web. He realized he couldn't just walk past them. He needed a shroud. A group of nuns, nearly a dozen of them in heavy black habits, were moving toward Gate 12. They were surrounded by orphans, a chaotic swarm of children in oversized caps. Arthur took a deep breath, removed his spectacles, blurring the world into a soft, hazy watercolor, and stepped into the middle of the group. He hunched his shoulders, clutching his bag to his chest like a prayer book. He passed within 20 feet of Moretti. He could smell Silas's tobacco, the expensive Turkish leaf he imported. Silas turned his head. His eyes swept over the nuns, over the orphans, and for a split second, they lingered on the small, hunched man in the middle. Arthur held his breath, his heart hammering so hard he was sure Silas could hear it. Moretti turned away. A boy had dropped a suitcase nearby, and the distraction saved Arthur's life. Arthur reached the gate. He handed his ticket to the conductor, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He stepped onto the platform, where the Mercury Limited sat like a silver bullet, its engine hissing white steam that vanished into the rafters. He found his compartment, locked the door, and sank into the plush velvet seat. He was safe. The train began to lurch forward. Clunk clink, clunk clink. The station began to slide away. Arthur let out a long, shuddering breath. He reached for his bag to finally look at the ledger, to make sure the sins of Chicago were still there. Knock, knock, knock. The sound on the compartment door was soft, almost polite. "Ticket inspection, sir," a voice said. Arthur froze. The voice was too deep, too smooth. It wasn't the conductor. He slowly reached into his bag, his fingers finding the .32 caliber pistol. He stood up and unlocked the door. Silas Moretti stood in the narrow hallway of the moving train. He was alone. No enforcers. Just Silas and a silver-headed cane. "You always were a clever little mouse, Arthur," Silas said, stepping into the compartment without an invitation. He sat down opposite Arthur, placing his cane across his knees. "The fire at the docks. Inspired. The nuns? A bit cliché, but effective. How did you get on?" Arthur whispered, the gun still hidden in the bag. "I own the rails, Arthur. Did you forget who paid for the governor's private car? I didn't need to find you in the hall. I just needed to be on the only train leaving for the east." Silas looked out the window. The outskirts of Chicago, the tenements, the factories, the endless soot, were flying by. "Give me the book, Arthur. We can go back. I'll put you in a house in Lake Forest. You can retire. No more numbers. No more blood." "You'll kill me before we reach Gary, Indiana," Arthur said, his voice regaining its strength. "I've seen the ledgers, Silas. I know what happened to the last retired accountant." Silas sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. "The problem with you, Arthur, is that you think the world is a balance sheet. That if you move a number from one side to the other, the debt is settled. But life is more like the heat. It doesn't care about your columns. It just consumes." Silas reached for his cane. Arthur didn't wait. He fired through the physician's bag. Pop! Pop! The muffled shots sounded like champagne corks in the heavy air of the train. Silas gasped, his hand clutching his chest. Blood, bright and shocking, began to bloom across his white linen shirt like a grotesque flower. Silas didn't fall. He looked at Arthur with a strange, crooked smile. You missed the heart, Arthur. You always were. Bad at the big numbers." Silas slumped forward, the silver-headed cane clattering to the floor. Arthur stood over him, his heart cold. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like another entry in the ledger. He took the book out of the bag, opened the window of the speeding train, and watched the wind catch the pages. The names of the judges, the lists of the dead, the prices of souls. They scattered like black birds over the scorched fields of Illinois. By the time the train reached New York, Arthur Penhaligon was gone. He had jumped somewhere near the Ohio border, leaving behind a dead king and an empty bag. In Chicago archives, 1932 is remembered as the Great Drought. But for those who knew the truth, it was the year when the Northern Syndicate collapsed, not from police bullets, but from the fact that its foundation, numbers and facts, simply vanished into thin air. No one ever saw Arthur again. They say that a man who has stared into the abyss of other people's debts for too long eventually realizes that the only way to wipe the slate clean is to become a ghost. Silas Moretti died in a luxury train car, bleeding to death in front of hundreds of passengers who didn't even realize that an entire era had come to an end. And the heat? The heat subsided the next day. Rain fell, washing the blood from the platforms and the dust from the streets, as if the city was trying to forget everything that had happened during those stifling hours.